Thank you for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome back two of our own, Kimberly Vinall, Emily Hellmich, who have been collaborating on a super exciting project, and which we're going to hear about today. So I'll make a brief introduction and then we'll get going, and I think that this is going to be a topic that's going to inspire lots of discussion. So keep track of your questions as you listen and think in terms of your own teaching experience and encounters you've had with machine translation. So our presenters today, both graduates of the Language Literacy and Culture PhD program in the Graduate School of Education, students of Claire Crampsch and of myself as well, teaching in Spanish and in French, respectively. Emily Hellmich is now Assistant Professor of French and Second Language Acquisition and Teaching at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And she teaches undergraduate classes in French language, linguistics, literature, and culture, and is also teaching graduate courses in second language acquisition, applied linguistics, and the role of digital technology in language learning. Her work is really centered on the intersection of globalization, digital technology, and language education. And some of her recent publications include in French, Dresser un point, la compétence sémiotique comme lien entre la littérature et le numérique, which will be appearing in French Review. Teacher Beliefs of Language Learning and Technology, Expanding the Ecology, recently published in the International Journal of Computer Assisted Language Learning. Call Beliefs in Context, a study of U.S. high school foreign language learners and computer assisted language learning, and a critical look at the bigger picture, macro level discourses of language and technology in the U.S., published in Calico. She also did a co-authored publication with Glinda Hull entitled Locating the Global Schooling in an Interconnected World. And one important publication that I should point out that both Kimberly and Emily worked on was a special issue of L2 Journal, which focused on critical perspectives on neoliberalism in second language or second and foreign language education, along with Noah Katz-Nelson, who is not here today, and Joran Shin. The four of them put together a beautiful special issue of L2 Journal, which is available online. Kimberly Vinall is a tenured Spanish instructor at De Anza College in Cupertino, and where she teaches a diverse student population at all levels of the Spanish language, Latinx culture, and literature. Her research draws from second language acquisition, applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and cultural studies. She's interested in how learners engage with cultural and linguistic differences and how their learning and identity construction is influenced by their teachers' personal experiences and the materials and pedagogical practices their teachers use. Her research and teaching has focused significantly on global critical service learning, the development of intercultural and symbolic competence, and teaching languages and cultures through a social justice lens. So some of Kimberly's recent publications include The Construction of the Tourist Gaze in English Textbooks in South Korea, exploring the tensions between internationalization and nationalization, which she co-published, co-authored with Joran Shin. Got Yorona. This is a great article in L2 Journal that I often send out to people who want examples of pedagogical, great pedagogical articles that go into detail but also have a strong theoretical base. Got Yorona is Teaching for the Development of Symbolic Competence. The Cultural Politics of Language Textbooks in an Era of Globalization, which she co-authored with Claire Crampsch. And again, the special issue that she edited with Emily, Noah, and Jaron, along with many, many others, but I don't want to go too long in the introduction. So that's just the most recent articles. Kimberly and Emily have launched on a really exciting collaborative research project that's focused on machine translation programs and how they relate to the teaching of language and culture. And what I think is really unique about their study is its focus on the learner perspective, the learner experience of what it's like to use these tools, what their attitudes and beliefs are, how what they think about using computers in school differs from how they think about using computers in their personal life outside of school, and how their attitudes and beliefs may or may not coincide with those of their teachers. So they're going to be talking to us about the latest material that they've developed in this project, and it is entitled "Machine Translation is a Lot Like Booze." Language instructors' beliefs about machine translation. Kimberly Vinall and Emily Hellmich.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Rick and to Mark and the whole BLC for having us here today. We're very excited to be sharing these findings with you.
Yes, and I also want to thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here on this lovely early spring day. It feels like spring might be arriving. So we're here to talk today, obviously, about machine translation, and specifically machine translation as it relates to language instructors. And our journey with this project and with machine translation actually began about 1.5 years ago, and it began with the BLC and in conversations that were taking place about how tricky MT could be for language instructors to deal with. And so we're so grateful for the BLC and to those conversations for starting us in this journey. And at the same time, we're really excited to bring the first of our findings back to this community today. So thank you again for being here. So by way of an introduction, we want to start with this picture, which is in its own way, we believe, frames and outlines what we're going to be talking about today. So first, this picture asks us to think about mechanics, with its gears and cycles and light bulbs and transfers. These processes allude to the importance of understanding what machine translation is and how it works, as well as how it has been positioned in past academic literature. So this is where we're going to start our presentation today, establishing an important baseline about what it is we're talking about. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the picture, as well as machine translation, asks us to think about relationships, how we relate to machine translation as individuals and as language instructors, how machine translation relates to learning, how machine translation mediates relationships between knowledge, language, and human beings, how machine translation mediates relationships between instructors and students, and how machine translation changes meaning-making practices and how we understand where meaning-making happens. So these are some of the bigger questions that both inspired our research into machine translations and that have also emerged from our research into machine translation. And these are some of the questions that we'll start to answer in this presentation today.
Right. So as tantalizing as those questions are, I promise we'll get back to them. We are going to back up a little bit, go back to those gears, to those cycles, to those light bulbs, and talk a little bit about the mechanics of machine translation, both what it is as well as how it works. So I'll start first by defining machine translation. Machine translation is the automatic translation using software or technology of a text from one language to another language. And Google Translate is probably the most infamous, the most well-known of these translation platforms, but there are others, including Bing Translator, as well as DeepL, which grew out of a platform that many of you may be familiar with, Lingua. So in contrast, so again, machine translation is automatically translating text from one language to another. In contrast are other online tools that you may be familiar with, things like online bilingual dictionaries, like Word Reference, things like parallel databases of human translations, like Lingue, as well as AI-based editing platforms, something like Grammarly or Bon Patron is an example of a French language version. So to really hit home the sort of difference between these platforms, or really the difference we want to highlight with machine translation, we're going to pull up a couple examples. So with machine translation, this is our beloved Google Translate. With machine translation, you can take entire chunks of text, including more than just word, written or produced in one language, put them into the platform, and they are then produced in the second language. And a good example that sort of shows the flexibility of this is a phrase like "take the dog out" in English, which is produced correctly in French as "sortir le chien." In contrast, if you take a program like Word Reference, which is an online bilingual dictionary, and you take the same chunk of text, the platform is not able to process that entire chunk of text. So what it gives you in this situation is different definitions of the verb to take. So it's not able to take on that whole chunk of text and produce language in that second language. So the big difference we're talking about here is that machine translation has this ability to produce the target language. So with sort of these lines around what we're talking about exactly, what tools, machine translation tools, we would like to spend a little bit of time talking about how machine translation works. And we think this is important for a couple reasons, but we're going to ask you to trust us, but also some of our participants who we think really highlighted some of the important reasons why it's important, the reasons why it's important to understand exactly how these programs are working. So this is an excerpt from an interview we did with an instructor of Italian who underscored two things. First, there's this need to educate ourselves, this need not only to educate ourselves, but to be prepared for these innovations that are coming. So one of the first reasons we think understanding how machine translation works is important is because this software is changing, it's changing rapidly, and there's a need that we have as educators to understand how it works. I will say, personally, this was not my first reflex. It was not my first reflex to go digging into engineering, how machine translation works, but I will say that it has changed my perspective and certainly has changed the way I think about using these tools in my classroom. The second reason is this idea here of becoming. And this is something we're going to come back to in the second part of the presentation. But it's important to bring it up now as something that's going to sort of be a red thread throughout. And that's this idea of the question of how is machine translation related to who we are as instructors, who we are becoming as instructors, as well as how is machine translation related to what we teach, and what we teach being language, what language is becoming. So with these two reasons in mind, having buttered you up, hopefully sufficiently, I'm going to turn to a slightly more technical discussion of exactly how machine translation works. So I'm going to parse these into two broad categories that is going to sort of bring together the different types that have been seen across time, but that are going to essentially categorize them into approaches. A little bit of a historical perspective, machine translation has been in the human imaginary since the 1800s, but it was not technologically possible until after World War II, late 1940s, 1950s. And that's when the oldest models, which are rule-based models, came to light. And rule-based machine translation models are essentially when you take the specific rules of language and they are programmed directly into the software. So if you have a language A and language B, all the rules of those two languages are programmed into the software program in order for language A to be translated into language B. So it's a lot of manual input, a lot of manual work on the front end for these rule-based machine translation platforms. In the 1980s and 1990s came statistical models, and that is a model where software is programmed to extract the rules from pre-coded corpora of data, pre-coded corpora of text. So the idea here is that by directing the computer in a particular way with human input, the computer, the system can deduce the rules of language. So both of these are very much top-down approaches. There are pre-coded rules or there are pre-written programs that are being applied to the language. And as many of us know, language is not always very rule-based. It varies. It has exceptions. It has nuance. So these sort of top-down approaches have had a lot of issues that kind of center around these questions about, can you always apply a rule and get the correct answer? So issues that you may have noticed yourselves, things like not being able to handle longer texts, like a sentence, for example, issues around rare words. So this is, statistical models is kind of where we ended in the actually not even, it started in the 1980s, but ending around 2016. Many of you may have also noticed that things changed with machine translation in the last few years, and that is a result of a different approach to machine translation. And that approach we'll call deep learning machine translation. Deep learning machine translation relies on machine learning and neural networks to draw out patterns in raw data. So in contrast to the previous models that were essentially pre-coded data, pre-written rules, what's happening with deep learning machine translation is that the software is constructing the rules themselves from raw data. So it's learning, more or less, the linguistic patterns as based on the data set that it's consuming. So deep learning machine translation requires two things. It requires large chunks of data, linguistic data, so written corpora, spoken corpora of text, and it also requires a lot of computing power because you take that data, you shove it in the system that's very strong, and it's able to essentially parse out rules of language from that system. So this is very much a bottom-up approach, right? So it's building up and building out the rules of language from language itself. So this updated product, this was, for example, launched by Google in 2016, their neural network Google Translate platform. The product here is much faster. It requires much less human programming. You don't need to pre-code the data, and it's much better. It handles rare words better. It handles longer texts better. So I recognize that this is a lot of information, and if you have questions on how this works, we can absolutely come back to this in the Q&A, and we will do our very best to answer your questions. With this nuts and bolts in mind of what machine translation is and how it works, we want to turn to where machine translation has intersected with research on second and foreign language learning. So the research in this area of machine translation and second and foreign language learning has fallen generally into two camps. The first is looking at beliefs and attitudes. So students and instructors, sometimes both, how they understand machine translation software. The second, which is more recent, is looking at what happens when you put machine translation into a classroom. What are the interventions or the results of different interventions? We are focused primarily on instructor beliefs. That is partly, I'm sure, because we are instructors ourselves, but also with, we're very interested in this connection between beliefs and behaviors. So what instructors believe about tools, about learning, about language, that impacts what happens in a classroom. So we think that this is an important piece to understand. So the research in this area, the research on instructor beliefs about machine translation, is relatively sparse. There's about 5 or 6 studies, more or less. And the studies have been relatively small, around 40 participants, up to 80, but around 40 for most of them. They've generally taken advantage of closed-ended survey models, so looking to send out a survey and get information from these closed-ended questions. And also, they have not addressed these new iterations of machine translation. They're working with the old statistical models before 2016. Research on machine translation has also largely stopped short of embedding machine translation and language learning within a larger ecology. So thinking about machine translation and language learning as they relate to larger issues and larger discourses. So some of the big questions that Kimberly started us off with today, these questions of relationships, machine translation, and identities, and students, the profession, meaning making, all of this has really not been adequately addressed in past research. And we think then it merits another look. So with that in mind, we set off, as Kimberly said, about 18 months ago to investigate this arena. And we had several objectives in mind. We wanted to update the literature on university instructor beliefs about machine translation tools to reflect the tools as they exist today, to reflect these more advanced versions of machine translation. We also wanted to look at a larger cross-section. We wanted to look at more instructors. And we also wanted to expand the methodological repertoire. We wanted to include more open-ended questions. We wanted to hear teacher voices with those open-ended questions, but also with interviews to sort of get more into these beliefs. And lastly, we wanted to expand this terrain of inquiry. We wanted to look at machine translation and how it's shaping language teaching and learning here in the US. So we will next talk through the research design that we created to tackle these questions, and then some select findings that we will share with you today.
So in talking about our research design, I'm actually going to be pulling some information from your handout on page 1 and 2 of your handout. And so hopefully everybody has a copy of that. So I'll start with the survey first. And we had close to 300 individuals start the survey. And when we'd cleaned up the data, factoring in completion rates of that survey, we narrowed this down to a total of 165 participants who had completed 90% or more of the survey. And so already our scale is considerably larger than some of the previous work that's been done. With regards to professional status of the participants in the survey, roughly a third were from the professor, lecturer, graduate, student categories. And the languages taught reflects historical trends, with Spanish having about a third of the respondents, followed by French at about 20%, and German at 13%, Italian represented about 5%, and less commonly taught languages in the US were also represented with those exact percentages in your handout there for you. So a vast majority of the respondents, about 80%, did come from public four-year institutions. And a few additional demographic pieces, such as the age and training, are also available on your handout. And we do have additional demographic information that we didn't put in the handout. And so if there are any other pieces that you feel like you're missing, we'd be happy to provide those to you during the question and answer session. So moving to the interviews then, we interviewed a total of 11 of the 165 survey participants. And I'll talk just in a few minutes about that selection process. So with regards to the professional status of those that we interviewed, there was a 50-50 split between lecturer and professor, with one graduate student represented. There were a range of languages taught, again, including historically dominant languages in the US, French, German, Italian, and Spanish, as well as less commonly taught languages, Arabic, Danish, and Japanese. And this is the information on page 3 of the handout, sorry for that, that has the summary of those participants, with the languages taught, their professional status, and the university type. Regarding the latter then, university type, the interviewees are based mostly at public universities with some representation from private institutions. So that's a summary of our participants. In terms of our data collection, we created the survey originally in the fall of 2018, and it did include a section, of course, on demographic information, but it also included sections on acceptability of machine translation use, policies regarding machine translation use, student perceptions of student machine translation use, as well as motivation, the pedagogical potentials of incorporating machine translation in the classroom, and considerations of machine translation as a threat or not to the profession. It included both open-ended questions as well as closed questions. So the survey was distributed in spring of 2019. For the first round, we did target major language learning organizations, contacting them and asking them to distribute the survey through their listservs. We also contacted individuals at a variety of different institutions across the United States and making personal requests as well for those to be distributed. And we did a round 2 of the surveys. In the second round, we were targeting the underrepresented groups from the first round. So, for example, we found in the first round that there were some underrepresented institution types, such as community colleges. There were also some languages that were underrepresented in the first round, and we wanted to try to target those specific aspects then to fill in the information. So from the interviews, for the selection criteria, we identified 12 themes from the survey data that we felt warranted further consideration. And then we identified survey respondents that sort of embodied those themes. And you'll see some of those themes as we go through some of our findings, and we'll highlight those later then. The interviews were conducted in the fall of 2019. We conducted them via Zoom, and the questions were then both theme-specific to those themes that we had identified as being themes we wanted to explore further, and there was also a general open set of thematic questions that was consistent across all of the interviews, and those largely then focused on instructor perceptions of the influence of machine translation on themselves as teachers, on their students, as well as on the profession. So for the data analysis, for the survey portion of the project, this analysis relied on descriptive statistics with the closed-ended questions. We did iterative open-ended axial coding with the open-ended questions, taking into consideration reliability measures. And for the interviews, we also did coding of the interviews, also focusing on those reliability measures. And so that's just a little bit of an overview to the research design and the data collection in our participants. And now Emily is going to start the process of summarizing some of our findings.
Yes.
Thank you.
We could be here for days, but we will spare you that. And we're going to divide our findings up into 2 main parts. So we're going to start with, as Kimberly said, some descriptive a descriptive summary. We're going to look mostly at the survey, and the goal here is to give a broad perspective on instructors' beliefs about machine translation. And then we're going to do a deeper dive, a more analytical dive, and that's going to focus on one particular analytical lens, which is metaphor, and that will come after this descriptive, the descriptive section. So what we want to do in this section is, again, to give you this big picture. We had 165 participants. What do they think about machine translation? And we picked out 4 major areas of inquiry that we wanted to share. And we'll kind of walk through this over the next few minutes. So first, we'll look at why instructor perspectives on why students even go about using machine translation. We'll then look at what is appropriate use of machine translation from an instructor perspective, what students learn potentially, and then we'll end with instructor thoughts on machine translation as a possible threat to the profession. So looking first at instructors' perspectives as to why a student might use machine translation. We saw as with many of these, these are not straightforward questions, right? So there are a multiplicity of things going on. We did see some common or prevalent answers. So showing up in more than 50% of all respondents' answers were 3 things: lack of confidence, grades, and the fact that machine translation was quick and convenient. So we'll dive into these one by one, these common themes. So first of all, this lack of confidence, it came up in both the closed-ended questions as well as coming up in the open-ended questions where instructors were able to sort of fill in without sort of these closed-ended prompts. And this quote comes from one survey participant, and that we like this quote because it kind of gets at these different layers of this lack of confidence, right? So this idea that students are really hard on themselves, and that they're afraid, they're scared of people thinking that they're stupid, even though they're trying really hard. And these are layers that many of us as learners or as instructors are likely very familiar with. Grades also came up in both the closed-ended and the open-ended questions. This immense pressure, as one instructor put it, for grades. This came up in about 50% of responses. This quote also illustrates a couple things. It illustrates two other factors that I'll go into in just a second, but also it goes back to that idea that I mentioned at first, that this idea that these are complex belief constellations, right? So when an instructor has a set of, answers a question like why do students use these tools? It's not just one thing. It's multiple things. It's a more complex belief structure. So the other two pieces you see in this quote are this idea of a desire to communicate, that machine translation is something that helps students communicate. They want to communicate, so they go to these tools. And also this idea of they spend so much time on their phones. We got a lot of stuff about phones and students spending a lot of time on digital technology, which brings this other third major theme we saw in response to this question, this idea that machine translation is used because it's quick and convenient. This came from our open-ended questions, and this was something that was surprisingly common. It was more than, between 55 and 57% of instructors noted this. And this is illustrated here, this idea of convenience, availability, this idea of being socialized, very interesting. And we played a lot with this as what do we do with this finding, right? Is this even an interesting finding, the fact that machine translation, the internet, is quick and convenient? Ultimately, we decided that for that reason exactly, it is important to acknowledge. It might seem banal, but it is referencing this larger omnipresence of technology and the pace of our modern day society. So it's quick and convenient, but let's interrogate a little bit more and what that means, and we'll come back to that. So there were, of course, many additional reasons. I'm not going to go into detail here. The second column, desire to communicate, a lack of time, or students are busy. All of these things in this middle category were about 1/3 to 40% of instructors noted these things. One thing I did want to mention, though, is something that's not here, is that very few participants thought that students used machine translation expressly out of a desire to cheat. It was a minority, about less than 5% framed student motivation in terms of express cheating. There was accidental cheating, and some other shades of gray that we'll get into, but that was something interesting. The belief constellation did not often include this idea of cheating. Another area that we looked into was what exactly do instructors think is appropriate use of machine translation? And we got at this with a series of scenarios. And the scenarios, just to sort of walk you through what we asked our participants to do. This is our first scenario. And the scenario is that a student is completing a writing task and they're translating what they have written into the target language. And we asked instructors to assess the appropriateness, if that's a word, of doing that for different lengths of text, all the way from one individual words to phrases, to complete sentences, to complete paragraphs, to then finally the entire task. And we did this across the 4 skills, so for writing, reading, listening, and speaking. And what we found was that instructors thought that it was largely appropriate or okay for students to use machine translation for individual words, and to a lesser extent, but still there, phrases of 2 or more words across the 4 skills. So for reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So to illustrate this with a little bit of data, and let me know if I turn, if you can't hear me. This is the acceptability rating across the 4 skills. So writing, speaking, reading, and listening. For individual words. And you can see that it was translating individual words was seen as highly acceptable across these 4 skills. And the same is true, although to a lesser extent, for phrases of 2 or more words. So again, we have the 4 skills across the bottom: writing, speaking, reading, and listening. And phrases of 2 words were around 50% were across these 4 skills. Instructors thought this was okay, this was acceptable. In contrast, machine translation was seen as largely inappropriate for complete sentences, complete paragraphs, and entire tasks, again, across the 4 skills. So here again, we have the responses of acceptability for the 4 skills, and this is for complete sentences. And about 80% of instructors found that using machine translation to translate complete sentences was unacceptable. This was particularly high for writing as well as for speaking. And this gets to be even more dramatic when we look at complete paragraphs. Upwards of 90% of instructors thought that translating entire paragraphs was inappropriate. So what we can see with this initial set of data here is that there is distinctions being made around appropriateness of machine translation that relates to the length of a text. However, there was, and you may have noticed, a slightly different case for reading. Reading was seen in many ways as a slightly different scenario. So a different type of graph to illustrate this. So along the bottom here, we have the different text lengths. So everything from a single word all the way to the whole task, comparing reading and writing. So what we can see is that using machine translation to translate reading was seen as more acceptable for longer periods of text. So comparing a single word, about on par, a little higher, 80% for reading, about 75 for writing. A little more stark when we come to a phrase, 63 when it comes to reading versus about 47 when it comes to writing. And then the biggest change you see here is with a whole sentence. About 27% of instructors thought that that was okay for reading, but it drops down to about 10% for writing. So there is something going on here in terms of reading being more acceptable for longer lengths of text. So we did see both in the survey and sort of these open-ended questions, as well as in our interviews, a couple of reasons why instructors thought reading might be a little different. The first was that reading was considered a way for students to access authentic material beyond their ability level. So this is a quote from a survey participant that we ended up interviewing, a professor of Japanese, who looked at reading as a way for her students who may not get to a point in their learning of Japanese, to a point where they can easily access texts, a way for them to then be able to engage with these different materials. This was also the case for many instructors at the basic language programs, for example, the first couple years. Students who may not be able to get at cultural nuance, get at these texts, reading through machine translation was seen as a way to do that. Another reason why it was different, this was less common but was still there, was this idea that machine translation could help students check their reading comprehension. That having read a text, they could then go back and see if did they get it right? Did they get the gist of it? And building their confidence that way. So, moving to our third sort of descriptive finding here, what do students learn from MT, from an instructor's perspective? As expected, again, we have this whole range of possible things that students learned. The most prevalent were vocabulary and the limitations of machine translation. So one instructor noted that students were able to find synonyms, better words, a wider range of words. And this really ties in with the finding from the previous section, this idea that if machine translation is acceptable for individual words, it can also be fueling, right, this vocabulary growth. The other major thing that students learned was that machine translation isn't perfect. According to instructors, One of the things that comes out of using machine translation is that machine translation is fallible, that you can't rely on it. There was a little bit of hope in this, I think. I hope. Wanting that to be a lesson that was learned, but it was certainly one that the instructors pulled out. I'm not going to spend time going in. These were also prevalent in the data, but we won't spend time going into those today. What I do want to spend a little bit of time on is talking about the contextual nature of this finding, of this general category. So what students learned was seen as being highly dependent on different factors. So any learning was often hinged to other stipulations. So for example, the biggest was learning happened if an instructor was able to step in and facilitate that learning. So a good example of this comes from an instructor who just notes that having a conversation, right, at the beginning of a semester, that is going to really, that's going to make learning happen or not. It's really the presence of that conversation, that pedagogical intervention. Other factors that instructors brought up were students themselves. If students were motivated, if they were just there to get their requirement, that would influence whether or not they learned something. Also their level. Students from more advanced levels were seen as more able to learn from machine translation because they were able to analyze the outcome, the output of the machine translation. So, lastly, we'll look at instructor perspectives on whether or not machine translation was or is a threat to the profession. So, we asked participants to react to the following statement. Machine translation is a threat to the language teaching profession. And the reaction was quite stark. Close to 70% of participants disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement. There was a high rejection of this statement that machine translation could threaten the language learning profession. And the explanation or rationale that came out in the open-ended question afterwards really covered two major camps. The first was a big distinction between language learning and machine translation, and the second was a big distinction between language teaching and machine translation. So you can see this big distinction between machine translation and learning here, this idea that students are not learning to produce or manipulate the language. They simply aren't learning the language. So that was a reason why machine translation could not threaten the profession. And this teacher goes on to stipulate that teachers are needed for that, right? The purview of teachers leading to the second distinction, which I think is much more aptly summarized by this teacher. Teaching a foreign language is much more than teaching translation. So these were the big major reasons why instructors did not see machine translation as a threat. However, there were some shades of gray. Of course, there were some instructors who did find machine translation to be threatening, but what was most interesting to us was alongside this sort of a strong revindication of the fact that machine translation was not a threat, was not language learning, was not about teaching, there was an acknowledgement that this opinion may not be shared. So instructors would acknowledge concerns that there would be institutional powers like universities or departments, students even, and maybe even the broader American public who would potentially equate machine translation to teaching and learning a language, and that perception, these ideologies, could potentially threaten the profession, although it was not a replacement. So this is a quote that I will let you read through as again, I think a very apt summary of this particular concern. So again, this idea that instructors felt very strongly about what these distinctions between machine translation and language teaching and learning, but that if others thought that it was dispensable, that might be a problem. So this descriptive data, this big picture overview tells us one story, this broad summary of our instructors' beliefs about machine translation as these tools stand today. But something that we set out to do, that I mentioned, was to expand this domain of inquiry, right? To move beyond description, to looking at broader questions, and using more intricate analytical tools. So the lens that we'll be taking today is that of metaphor. So metaphor, or what participants likened machine translation to, allows us an interesting way to explore the relationships that we talked about right at the beginning, how instructors saw themselves in relationship to machine translation, as well as in relationship to their students. So I will pass it off to Kimberly for that.
So I want to highlight just a couple of things about this idea of metaphor before I jump into it. We didn't actually ask a specific question about metaphor, so we never asked anybody, what metaphor would you use for machine translation? These sort of emerged rather organically. And with reference to the survey, which is the first part that I'm going to talk about, in that survey, it showed up across multiple open-ended questions. And so I'm not going to be attaching necessarily any of my analyses to those questions because they sort of were showing up throughout the data that we were receiving as we were analyzing it. We were able to identify in the survey data 5 primary metaphors that emerged. The first is that MT is a dictionary, but not just as a dictionary that's on steroids. And I'll get to that idea of the steroids in a minute. And the second and third are both metaphors that involved machine translation as a tool, but they were such different understandings of that tool that I've split them into 2. So the first was then this idea of machine translation as a tool of deception, and the second being another tool that we have in our toolbox. So I'm going to go through each of these. Oh, and the other 2 were MT as an instrument, and this has a calculator, and MT as a crutch. I'm going to focus on the first 3 primarily, although just be slightly touching on the second 2. But the first 3 are the ones that I'll go into in a little bit more depth regarding those metaphors. So the first one is the idea of the MT as a dictionary on steroids. And so from this perspective, MT really represents this quick and easy fix to a problem. And one of the survey participants noted that this quickness is something that mirrors the pace of post-modernity. And it's for this reason then that it's a dictionary on steroids, because it gives us this quickness, this fast ability to respond to this problem. From this perspective, then, students also are using machine translation because Google is just everywhere. They've been habitualized into using Google, having it on their phones, looking for information on Google, and this is just an extension of that sort of habit or that instinct that students have. The instructors from this perspective considered MT use to be acceptable at the word level, which reflects the findings that Emily just finished presenting regarding text length in relationship to acceptability of MT use. However, beyond that word level, it is considered both, and I quote, an obstacle for learning, and again, another quote, an easy way out. In this case, it's likened to cheating then, essentially. So as related to this use then that goes beyond the word level into the sentence level or the paragraph level, the students within this metaphor were largely constructed as lazy or weak. They did not want or were not able to put in the effort to do the work themselves. And finally, in relationship to this question of machine translation being a threat or not, it's interesting to note that from this perspective, MT is largely considered not a threat, quite simply because we as teachers are not dictionaries, whereas MT is just a dictionary. So therefore, it doesn't represent any threat to us, to the profession in terms of us as teachers. Additionally, it's possible to just teach students how to use machine translation. And that the instructors themselves can provide all of the things then that machine translation can't provide. So this is the first of the metaphors. The second is machine translation as a tool of deception. And this is the first of those two tool metaphors then. It's interesting about this idea of MT as a tool of deception, I think, because this deception is happening at multiple levels. And the first level that it happens is at the level of the students. And so the students are deceived because they don't actually learn anything from using machine translation, and because they also don't realize machine translation's limitations, what it's not capable of doing. At another level, the instructors are deceived by students who are cheating through using machine translation. And in the process of this cheating, they're also disrespected. And interestingly, several of the instructors also reported that the use of machine translation deprived them of the opportunity of seeing what students are actually learning, because it's covering up. They're not seeing the actual student work. And so they're missing that sense of, well, but what are students actually getting and learning from the class? The deception also happened at the level of language learning itself, because as the one participant expressed it, MT, and I quote, obscures the hard work involved with becoming proficient or fluent in a foreign language, end quote. And so we saw this idea repeated quite a lot, this idea of MT covering up this fact that learning a language is a difficult process, it's difficult work, and it's deceptive because it makes you think that it's quick and easy, like the dictionary on steroids, but it's actually not. And finally, there's some level of deception involved around this presumed purpose of the language requirement, because students are using machine translation in order to get good grades, to pass the class and fulfill the language requirement without actually learning much about the language or much about the culture. And so the original goals or purposes or objectives of the language requirement are somehow then being undermined in this process. And so that's the machine translation as a tool of deception. Now, a very different perspective on the metaphor of the tool is that MT is actually a new tool in our toolbox. And so from this perspective, MT is seen as potentially supporting learning, but it is simply a tool among many others of the tools. And this word simply was used quite a lot and showed up quite a lot in this data, talking about MT use from this perspective. In this case, then, as a new tool in our toolbox, this our was presumably in reference to the instructor. So in other words, then, that it's the instructor that is in the role of mediating the use of machine translation in order to ensure that machine translation isn't abused. And it also doesn't become a crutch then, something that interferes with the language learning process. And it's interesting because we found a whole lot of adverbs used to describe this, which included judiciously, effectively, appropriately, efficaciously, efficiently, wisely, and properly and carefully. And so these are the different ways in which we need to teach students how to use machine translation. I find the adverbs interesting and also interesting in relationship to some of the reasons why instructors believe that machine translation is used by students, and that is also because it's quick, easy, and convenient. So we're going to teach them how to use it effectively and efficiently. So as mediators then, in this process also involves teaching students the limits of machine translation, what it's not able to do, what it's not able to handle. So this perspective also seems to recognize that MT is not a transparent tool. That as MT is not a transparent tool, language is also not a transparent tool. So students need to also learn to tolerate ambiguity, to appreciate the importance of context, to grasp the complexity of language, for example. And finally, many of the instructors from this perspective, from the perspective of this metaphor, express this belief that MT is already out there. It's already part of our globalized world, and students are already using it. So they better know how to use it critically. And that's the other idea of it being a tool in our toolbox. And one of our roles then as mediators, as instructors, is to teach them this critical use of machine translation. And so this then becomes potentially another goal of the foreign language classroom, to teach the critical use of this technology. So that's a summary of the three main metaphors from the survey data. As I mentioned earlier, we conducted a total of 11 interviews. We also did not ask in the interviews for instructors to necessarily produce metaphors, but again, we found that they were producing them everywhere. With the interviews, we went through a process of preparing case studies. And as part of our coding, we also then were identifying, just as we did in the survey data, we were identifying these metaphors throughout the interviews as they were showing up. So the case studies that we prepared, as well as this coding, allowed us to go into sort of a deeper dive into the world of metaphors with respect to what they reveal about the relationships between machine translation and instructor identities, the construction of the student identities, and understandings of language and language learning itself. So there were a few additional metaphors that showed up in the interview data that did not show up in the survey data, although pretty much in general, there was a mapping in terms of these metaphors. So what I'm going to present today is actually a small slice of two of the case studies that we have. And these two were chosen because they represent really two very different perspectives on how machine translation and its use mediates these relationships between the instructors and students, between the language and language learning. And then we also feel like these two particular case studies open up some really interesting and important spaces to consider the implications of this mediation. So this part of the analysis is still very much in process. It's very exciting to share it with you today, and we're also looking forward to any comments or reflections you have to add to it when we're done presenting it. So I'm going to start with the first case, and for the first case features an instructor with the name of Casey, a pseudonym of course. And Casey identified MT as both a tool and as a crutch. And Casey was an associate professor of French at a medium public state university. So Casey identifies MT as both a tool and a crutch. She believes that translation in any form, including Google Translate, is a crutch because translation is simply not learning the language. In the classroom, she discourages students from using any form of machine translation, and she's proactive in explaining to them why it is a crutch and why they shouldn't be using it. She also offers strategies and alternatives to students that would, from her position, help them to actually learn French. So I'll give you a minute to read that because I know it's a long quote. So again, as I said, this instructor encourages students not to use machine translation and provides strategies to help them to support their learning so they don't feel the need to rely on machine translation. But unfortunately, as this quote reveals, from her perspective, this approach to regulating machine translation use in the classroom has largely been not successful. So quite the opposite, she identifies it as being a struggle. And it's important to note that this struggle is not because of Google Translate itself. So she's not locating the source of the struggle with Google Translate, but instead because of her own perceived inability to communicate successfully to students what it means to learn a language and why machine translation won't help them to learn a language. She's really sympathetic to students. She acknowledges that she understands why they might rely on Google Translate as a crutch. In this case, they fear making mistakes, and they're uncomfortable submitting something that doesn't reflect adult speech, something that they feel is simplified. And of note, she also identifies here one of the goals for her of language learning, and that is that the language becomes a part of yourself. And she believes that this goal cannot be achieved through the use of Google Translate. There are implications of this struggle that she identifies in this quote with respect to her own identity and her role as a foreign language teacher and in relationship to the students in terms of the relationships she has with students. And I'm going to talk about 5 of these primary implications of this struggle that she's named. And in terms of the implication of this struggle with respect to her own identity and her own role as a foreign language teacher, she first reports feeling personally insulted when students use Google Translate and try to pass it off as their own work, asking, and I quote, "Do you really think you weren't going to get caught?" End quote. So this speaks again to that metaphor of MT as a tool of deception, because we have this sense of the deception here. It's not only is it deceptive in terms of the belief that it can be used to support language learning, but it is deceptive because the student is ostensibly trying to pull one over on the teacher. It is interesting that she repeatedly pulls away or pulls back from attributing to the student's negative intentionality, saying, for example, and I quote, "I don't think they mean to be disrespectful. I think they're just not thinking," end quote. So second, she reports feeling delegitimized in her authority and knowledge when students respond to her corrections with, "But Google says." Here we see her perception that Google is displacing her then as the source of knowledge for students. And she suggests that this displacement diminishes her own personal and career history with regards to the effort that she put into achieving what she has achieved. And presumably this would include her own process of learning French. This feeling mirrors her earlier report of feeling insulted by the displacement and the sort of sense of loss of respect that accompanies it. So third, Casey seems to question her own multilingual identity as a legitimate speaker of French. She also resorts to using Google Translate to double-check students' production, thereby also attributing legitimacy to Google as the source of knowledge or as a source of knowledge. As she expressed earlier, one of the goals of language learning that Google Translate cannot support is for the language to become a part of yourself. However, machine translation and its role in her own life and that of her students seems to be separating her from that part of herself. Fourth, she reports becoming other than who she is as a teacher. She considers herself as a teacher who cares, and she uses this word care a lot throughout the interview. She cares for her students, and she strongly desires to help them to learn. And we can see this manifested, for example, in the strategies that she teaches them so they do not need to rely on the use of Google Translate. However, she reports that their continued use of machine translation has made her feel, and I quote, "mean, cynical, and frustrated," stating, and I quote, "If they don't want to put in the time and effort to actually do the work to learn, then I really don't have the energy to put into helping them," end quote. So finally, the last implication is that Casey questions her own positioning and relevance in the teaching profession. She is holding her ground in this struggle, but she is also just hanging on, wondering if she will last another 10 years for retirement. So we see then from the survey data that largely machine translation was rejected as being a threat to the profession, but we can see very strongly here that there is a threat to an instructor, to the instructors in terms of their sense of identity. This was case study 1, and I turn now to case study 2, which is that of Amelia, who is a lecturer of Italian at a large private university. And this is the metaphor that Amelia uses for machine translation. So Amelia does use the tool metaphor to talk about machine translation. In the previous case study, that of Casey, Casey attached the idea of the tool to a crutch because the machine translation interferes with language learning, and she identifies her struggle of trying to communicate to students why it is a crutch. In contrast, Amelia attaches the idea of the tool to the idea of a bridge. So more specifically, machine translation has the potential to function as a bridge between the students and the experienced human translator, or us, in this case, presumably instructors, who, like machine translation, are also translators, but in contrast to machine translation, they are human and they are experienced. So machine translation here can be a bridge because it can function as an assistant to the instructor. And from this perspective, Amelia does not consider her own role to be that of policing the students and their MT use. As she explains, and I quote, "Instead of being me laying down the law and telling them you can use this, but you cannot use that, it's more of an agreed upon and collaborative effort," end quote. So both her and her students reach a collective agreement on acceptable uses of apps and technology, including machine translation. And machine translation's role as an assistant to her as instructor has implications in terms of then her perceived sense of identity, as well as in her role as instructor, as well as the relationship with students. And so in this case, I'm going to highlight 4 of these implications. So first, Amelia emphasizes the possibility of building a relationship of trust with the students, both in creating this collective agreement that is established at the beginning of the semester on the acceptable uses of technology, and in recognizing and giving them credit for being savvy users of technology. So she says, and I quote, "I think that many of them are knowledgeable in terms of what app works best for whatever it is that they are doing. So there is part of me that wants to trust them a little in the choices they make." So second then, with machine translation in the role of an assistant, she retains the authority as a legitimate source of knowledge of the language because students come to her for confirmation of what they're finding by looking things up in machine translation. And this is a stark contrast then to what we saw with Casey in terms of the role that machine translation has as a source or an authority in relationship to knowledge. So third, machine translation becomes a tool to help students to learn about language and to be open to the language learning process that goes beyond the level of translation to include reflections on meaning making itself. So she incorporates machine translation into the classroom, reporting that, for example, students will translate something using word reference only, something using Google Translate, and then they will analyze and compare those 2 different translations that are produced. Through the process, she believes that they become productive and independent learners who, as we can see from this quote, question language, make mistakes, and recognize the power of words. So both Casey and Amelia highlight that students use machine translation because of fear of making mistakes. In this case, however, students can rid themselves of this fear because they recognize that language learning is about more than the structures of language itself. So here we go back to that idea of machine translation as quick and easy and convenient. But because of the fact that it is quick and easy and convenient, she believes that the pause has been lost. And that is the pause where students reflect on meaning making and potentially reach a deeper level of understanding. So MT can provide this immediacy. It is an assistant, but she, as the instructor, is the one who can add back the pause for the students. Therefore, her role is to help them to inhabit the pause, to see how the, and I quote, word tastes in your mouth. How does that sentence feel? And in the process, students can learn how to rely on context to explore the meanings of words. So these are two very different case studies. And in contrasting these two different perspectives, some interesting things come to the fore, I think, in terms of the what is at stake question around machine translation. So from Casey's perspective, Casey seeing machine translation as a tool or a crutch, machine translation seems to deprive instructors, and I would argue students as well, of agency. It negatively impacts the relationship between the instructor and the student, and this relationship seems to hinge on this question of trust. So the trust in the students, the trust in the intentions of the students, and in their respect for the instructor, in the classroom, and in the language learning process itself. And that ultimately machine translation interferes with or prevents language learning. In contrast, in Amelia's case, who sees MT as a tool and a bridge, students, instructors have agency with respect to MT use. MT contributes to a positive relationship between instructors and students, again, and especially in relationship to this question of trust. The trust can be built and maintained through the collective agreements. And the instructor can provide something very different than MT, which are these deeper insights into language and meaning making. I'm going to pass it back.
So, where do we go from here? How can we summarize the journey we've taken you on today? We started out with the gears and the light bulbs and the processes, the nuts and bolts of machine translation, followed by this big picture, this larger survey sample of university instructors and their understandings of machine translation, how it stands today. And then Kimberly with this deeper analytical dive into both survey and interview data with this lens of metaphor. And these case studies and these lenses, this lens of metaphor brings out some really important ramifications that we want to highlight, ramifications of the intersection of machine translation and instructor beliefs. This idea of agency, the agency of this instructor, agency of students, the impact of machine translation on student-instructor relationships, thinking about where meaning making happens, as well as how do instructors consider themselves, how do they position themselves in the classroom as well as in the profession. So as a way to wrap up and an attempt to summarize, we're actually going to go back to the very beginning, which is our title, which may have caught some of your attention. So we like to put it in a little context, and I'll let you read our interviewee, Alan, who gave us this gem of a title. So true to form, or true to his expectations, we are including this in the paper and presentation. But we think it's also a great quote for summarizing where we'd like to come to in terms of implications as well as next steps. So one of our major takeaways here, what we've learned from this data, is the importance of using machine translation responsibly. And for that, we think there needs to be a lot more pedagogical examples of how do you thoughtfully incorporate, discuss, reference machine translation in the classroom. We need more articles like Kimberly's, got Yorona, and we need that for machine translation. But we also think that this quote speaks to a larger responsibility, and that is the responsibility to think about machine translation responsibly, to think about it more broadly, how it works, its consequences, these implications that this metaphorical lens offered us, what it means to language teachers, to students, to what language is and what it's becoming. So, with that, we thank you. And we would love your questions. Questions or reactions?
Was there any distinction made between translating from the L2 on the one hand and to the L2 on the other?
In terms of our scenarios? Yeah, so all the scenarios were to the L2, to the target language. And we didn't specify if it was English or another language, but we did not, first honestly, time's sake and survey fatigue, we did not do the opposite of translating from the L2 into the L1.
Because Casey, or maybe it was Amelia, but one of the two case studies seemed to, in one of those quotes, be talking about looking up words from texts that they were reading or something, in the classroom environment. So, pulling out their phone and doing something quickly. So that seemed to be translating from the L2 rather than to the L2.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that is true. We didn't survey that. It did come up in interviews as one of the ways in which students are using Google Translate in the actual classroom to look things up in readings and things like that. But we didn't spend the time in the survey for that.
Because, I think there is a difference between the two as well, as far as what the implications are for foreign language education.
Yeah, if they're just using it if they're going one direction or another. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you do look at that when you compare reading versus writing.
That's true.
You are.
That's, yeah, more. So thinking of that as being more acceptable. Yeah.
I have a methodology question too, but first I want to ask you, was there any discussion of instructors saying, in fact, I do teach them how to drink responsibly, and here's how I have it outlined in my syllabus, or here's what I go over in session 1 and review in session 8 of the semester? Were there any of your interviewees who commented on that?
Yes. We did ask specific questions for those that had indicated in the survey that they did in fact teach students how to use it responsibly. We followed up with the interviews to ask questions about how they were using it and what they were doing, which is where in the case of Amelia, the data comes from about using word reference in contrast to Google Translate and bringing those texts in as a basis of analysis. And so that's where that data came from that. We do feel though overall there was just this strong sense in both the surveys and in the interviews of instructors calling for, we need to have discussions about this, we need more ideas about how to do this. What does it look like? What can these pedagogical implications be? And what's really interesting is that really in terms of the work that's been doing and that's been published, nobody's addressing this huge gap in terms of providing space for these discussions and for people to be sharing what it is they're doing and what those outcomes are.
I noticed Manuel Correa had an article kind of on cheating in the classroom, and I was thinking if anybody spelled out, if you translate a word or a few words, but if you do whole paragraphs or whole texts, then you're going to be cited, for cheating or something.
And we did ask in the survey if people had, instructors had policies, we asked them to share those policies, and there was quite a range of, no, we don't have an official class policy or department policy, to we do, that it's absolutely not allowable, and so there was a full range of good responses.
Just on a quick methodology, I saw you had a couple, it seemed like just maybe 2 participants were from Chinese languages, and maybe when you grouped in Korean and Japanese, you get up to 14 or 15. And these participants were all in the US? So I was wondering if there would have been a distinction between Chinese, Korean, Japanese usage for some of the writing and reading versus English to Spanish to Italian to Portuguese.
Yeah.
Have you teased that out yet?
It's there, yeah, and so one of the next layers of analyses is to do the correlation work to see, are there specific trends that are attributed to certain languages or certain levels or certain educational backgrounds, and so that is certainly something we're interested in exploring further. We did anecdotally from interviews, we did hear from some of the participants who taught less commonly taught languages that there was a significant difference in the accuracy for Arabic, for example, in Japanese, that they were not, the translation, it was a different ball game, essentially. So
okay.
we are look forward to exploring that.
Thanks.
I'm curious if you guys noticed differences between native speaker instructors and non-native speaker instructors, and particularly in the two cases you showed. I sort of started to suspect that Casey was non-native and Amelia was native, and especially around sort of that identity crisis and authority and how much that's coming out.
It's there. It's there, and it is there in that particular case, and it's showing up in other places as well. So what the original preparation of these case studies has identified is this is something we need to go back and look at more closely than across the board. So this is, again, the next part of our analysis, because there does seem to be a strong relationship there that's worth exploring. Yeah. Claire, and then.
I'd like to go back to your original, the example that you gave for machine translation. Taking out the dog, or take out, sorry, not take out the dog, but take the dog out. which is quite sophisticated, I mean, okay. So take the dog out. I think the fact that the machine translation comes out with sortir le chien is quite remarkable. I mean, I don't think anybody in French 1 would think of using a word like to go out the dog is contra-intuitive to a learner of French who thinks it's one-to-one equivalent. I want to go back to that because none of your teachers seem to even entertain the idea that the algorithm that has been programmed into the computers to transform take the dog out into sortir le chien would be worth looking at to know how computers learn the language. And would there not be something that human teachers might learn from the intelligence of the computer?
That's turning things around.
Well, I mean, it's a serious problem because anytime you have a phrasal unit like that and it's in, you know, if it's in the most usual context, that's fine. But as soon as you know, you're on the street, you know, where you have a bunch of mob families and the dogs are knocking over the garbage cans, Bruno gets home and says, "Take that dog out." How do you interpret that? You know, now it may not be, you know, sortir le chien. It may be descendre le chien. So the you know, all of this stuff is so contingent on, and this is where teachers come in because, you know, they have to, you know, draw the student's attention to all of the factors that are involved in the meaning and not just the most local that the machine translator is working on.
Yes.
But in the vast majority of cases, you know, these contexts are going to be relatively generic, and the benefit of the doubt is always going to go to the computer because it's dealing with the, you know, the most normal situations. But especially with literary texts, you may have, you know, surprise, you know, the author is not just, you know, using language in the most ordinary, conventional ways all the time. And so that's where you can have issues.
Yes.
But to your question, Claire, I do also think that, so I have, actually I can pull the books up. I've been reading about the mechanics of machine translation for the past like month or so. And it has made me think really different, you know, I have a very different perspective on machine translation than when I started. And I think not only could teachers learn from understanding that the algorithm, but also students, because exactly as you're saying, Rick, the algorithm is probabilistic. It's looking at the probability and what does, you know, what do you get when you get the probable answer, right? What do you not know? How could you include that in a classroom in a way that makes that algorithm actually a learning tool?
Well, especially because all the teachers were saying that the advantage of using Google Translate is the vocabulary. They were fixed on the word, whereas that algorithm is pattern-driven.
Right.
So what would it mean to teach a language in a pattern-driven pedagogy?
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, you had a question, yeah.
Yes, first of all, I'm not a language teacher. I'm a language learner.
Learner, as are we all.
And I want to just state two examples before I ask my question. The first example was yesterday. Some people know Professor Tyler, who's the Dean of Humanities at UC Santa Cruz. He was here on campus, and he taught himself to speak French at a late date in life, switching what he was going to go into, et cetera, et cetera. So I was sitting next to him, and I said, Professor Tyler, give me some hints about an easy way to learn this language. And without hesitation, he says, just listen to people speaking it. Listen to the radio. Listen to wherever speaking. Put down the books, the writing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first example. My second example, I was accepted into the Peace Corps, West Africa, to learn a language, 2 languages that I'd never heard about. And I was very put off by the fact that there were some language teachers in there, and we really wanted to write something, anything, but they said no books, no paper, no pencils. Just listen and repeat. Listen. And for 8 hours a day, for almost 2-3 months, that's all we did. Listen and repeat. There was writing nothing. So my question is, if this machine learning is dependent upon, it depends upon the writing and the reading, why doesn't the language separate the two? So you have a section for writing and reading, but that will come after people are hearing and responding to the language orally, so that they begin to build up what is sort of right in their minds before they move on to what they need to write and read. That's mine.
The bad news is Google Translate also has it now, so where you can translate speech. Sorry. Just had to put that in. Sorry, you're gonna respond.
No, go ahead. That is somewhat bad news, yes, but I think it comes down to the pedagogical approach, right? It sounds like the method in the Peace Corps was a much more audiolingual approach, very focused on all that audio, auditory stimuli. I think it comes down to what is the pedagogical approach of machine translation? Like, how do we, and I'm not sure any of what is currently out there, we're gonna have to modify, I think is maybe my not complete answer to your question. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so I just had a question about the data of the teachers. So I understand that you pulled out these themes and you're thinking about that. But one of the things that surprised me is that, one of the metaphors I heard about learning from your data was that, language learning is hard, that you struggle, you have to go through the struggle. And I thought that was really interesting. And it gave me pause, it made me think about a lot of things that I do. And I was just wondering, because I didn't see a lot of it in this data, but maybe in some of your other data, do the teachers themselves, I do understand that pedagogy would reflect your theory of learning, but not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. But did the teachers have an idea about really learning, like how students learn a language? Like, for example, in your data, I never saw a teacher say, well, they have to memorize something. So I was just wondering about that. What did the teachers think about learning? And of course, this harkens back to the idea of the machine could be a better learner.
Right.
So we didn't ask them specifically about their own beliefs about language learning. So we didn't go into that directly. So we have no direct responses to that. It was more, but it showed up indirectly in answers to other questions, I would say. And I think for me, that's an interesting piece moving forward in terms of going back and potentially doing more interviews, is anchoring it back into their own beliefs about language learning independently of machine translation, because we were focusing so directly on machine translation. Especially given this interesting finding about it being such a hard process, and then also There was some really interesting contrast between instructors who were really coming at language learning, or seemed to be coming at language learning from a very sort of, language learning is about memorizing vocabulary and verb forms and structures and functions, and others were learning languages completely different than that. So we also had these ideas, well, some of the instructors postulated, well, machine translation can maybe take care of that. It can take care of that simple stuff, right? So that we can focus on these other things that are much more important about language learning, and that's thinking about meaning-making processes and all of these other things that are a part of language learning, which I think is an interesting response to how is machine translation potentially going to be altering the classroom to think about. So the idea of the walking, one of the instructors talked about the walking dictionary, that machine translation freed her from being a walking dictionary. And that by freeing her of being the walking dictionary, she was able to focus her teaching on other things that she felt like were more important. And so that was liberating for her, which was an interesting to think about as the dictionary metaphor.
Yeah. And yeah, just to echo that, we also felt very called by this language learning as a struggle. You know, that it called a lot into question, as you said, and so we're excited to continue to explore that.
You talked about trust between teachers and students, and I'm just wondering if trust came up with the machine translation at all, whether that got mentioned, because there's tremendous potential for wreaking havoc with people's communication.
Yeah. I think that there was some instructor concern around, and that would have been coded under the limitations of machine translation, this idea that concern that the students are copy pasting blindly, right, from machine translation and just throwing it in their assignments. So I think that there was a concern there, but I'm not sure it came up in terms of the consequences in real life communication. I'm not sure it came up as closely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the trust in the machine translation did come up. I think it will be interesting in the next stage when we're interviewing or surveying students to look at that question of trust from their perspective in terms of, because there's this perception that the instructors have that students on the one hand sort of blindly accept whatever machine translation pulls out, but then we saw like in the case of Amelia where there's this idea that they're savvy users of technology, and in this savviness they may already have this sense that it's not to be trusted what machine translation is producing, but we don't have the student perspective on that.
Can you talk just a little bit about the student phase and whether you're using the exact same materials or?
Do we know that? Yeah, so the next phase is going to be, I think we're going to look to try to do a similar, we're going to look at similar constructs in students, so how students are looking at things like acceptability, what they learn, what is appropriate use. I think I already said that. So try to mirror. I think we have not come down on a decision as to whether or not it will be the exact same survey, but that will then lead into, I think, a part we're very excited about, which is also looking at how students use these tools. So actually recording the screen, watching them, talking to them. How do they go about? I mean, it came out of, I don't know if you've ever walked past a student working and they have about 17 tabs open and they're running through, 3 of them very rapidly. And I think it would be really interesting when we're talking about this meaning making, are they pulling things blindly or is it a much more complicated process?
And what's the time there? So if they're pulling something, so yeah, to get at, no one's documented what students are actually doing with machine translation. And this is the piece
and that's what we're excited to do.
We're
Next.
Yeah, I think Billy, you have to
That's a quick question, or you use this based upon Google, and true, Google here in this country, it's everywhere. But what about looking at students from other countries where Google is not available and seeing what they do or not do compared to your data?
Yeah, I think that could be and even comparing these other platforms. I didn't know about this DeepL, for example, Lingway's new deep learning, but apparently it's better than Google Translate, is what their advertising tells me.
And their competition is intense.
Yes. It's also each pay for it, which is an interesting model change. So yeah, I think that's I think it's, you know, a good idea. Yeah.
But did you hear any concern that by emphasizing the fact that Google Translate liberates the teacher from all the structures, vocabulary, all the nuts and bolts of language learning, to teach the students what a computer allegedly cannot, namely meaning, interpretation, the difficulty of understanding, etc. They are in fact saying that their role as language teachers are basically literature teachers and cultural teachers, and is putting in question their administrative status as language teachers.
Interesting. Yes, it is. I think there are a lot of paradigms that come out in different ways as being challenged through our data.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the language-literature divide. One other one are notions of authentic text and whether or not texts produced by Google are authentic or not authentic. So there's a lot of these paradigms that I think are reflected in our data, and that I think machine translation is pushing in interesting ways. And I think that one in particular, at a structural level, I find really interesting.
Okay, thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.